Welcome to a place where love isn't loud, but it never leaves, where the ones who wait in silence love the deepest. Here, we tell the stories the world forgets, of the quiet presence in seasons of struggle, the respect that blossoms in worn soil, and the kind of love that never demands but always gives. If you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever wondered if love can exist without words, without conditions, without applause, you're in the right place, because in this corner of the world, we honor the kind of love that doesn't chase, but stays. That doesn't break in distance, but waits in devotion, and sometimes, love is just a shadow in the background, lighting every step, even when forgotten. Subscribe, stay close, and let your heart rest here. These are not just stories, they're the truth we all long for. It began the year the sky forgot how to rain, the fields cracked, the wheat turned brittle, and my father's shoulders carried more than just the weight of drought. We lived by the seasons, and when the seasons failed us, we quietly disappeared from the noise of the world. There was no time for dreaming, only surviving. I learned young how silence could fill a room, how quiet pain could stretch across a dinner table, and how to read the difference between stillness and surrender. In those days, my hands were always busy. Mornings started before the sun, and the dirt under my fingernails had become a second skin. I was the daughter of a man who spoke more to the land than to people. My world was rows of crops, the rhythm of hard labor, and the deep loneliness that comes from being too poor to dream out loud. And then he came, not with fanfare, not like a storybook prince, just quietly, like wind brushing the grass. The first time I noticed him, he was standing beside an old fence post, just watching my father's tractor choke in the heat. He didn't speak, didn't wave. He just nodded when I passed with the watering can, and then disappeared into the dust like he had never been there. I told myself he was lost, that he'd wandered off the paved road and would never return. But he did again and again, never at the same time, never making noise, always watching from a respectful distance, never closer than he needed to be, never so far I couldn't feel his presence. Some days he brought water and left it at the gate. Other days he just leaned against the tree near the edge of the road, saying nothing. But I knew, somehow I knew, he wasn't here to take anything. He wasn't curious about our suffering. He just was. He started helping my father in the quietest ways. One morning, the tractor that had groaned and sputtered came to life without complaint. Another week, bags of seed that had been empty were full again. He never brought it with a smile or expected gratitude. It just appeared, like rain after prayer, and still not a word. He was younger than I expected, maybe 30. His clothes were always plain but clean. His boots too new to belong here. There was something about him, how he watched the wind bend the trees, how he never looked at me too long, how he always seemed to know when to vanish. He wasn't from this world. Not from one like ours anyway, but he understood something most people didn't. Presence meant more than performance. My father never asked questions. Maybe he was too tired, or maybe he understood men like that didn't come around often, and when they did, you didn't scare them off with suspicion. You let them be what they wanted to be, helpers, listeners, shadows. Winter came hard that year. We lost half the cattle. My boots split open at the soles, and my coat had more patches than fabric. One morning, I woke to find a wrapped package at the door. Boots, perfectly my size. No note, no name, but I knew it was him, that quiet man who never asked for attention. Still, I had never spoken to him, until the day the fire came. A dry wind blew across the hills, and within minutes, flames devoured everything. The barn collapsed before we could save the animals. I was coughing in the smoke, trying to pull my father out when arms grabbed me from behind and dragged me away. Strong arms, familiar in a way that made my heart panic and calm at the same time. It was him. He didn't speak, just pulled me behind him, wrapped a wet cloth around my face, and forced a path through the smoke. When we reached safety, he disappeared again. Before the firefighters even arrived, he was gone, like always. No glory, no thanks. That was when I realized something I had tried not to name. He didn't just appear in our struggle. He stayed in it, chose it, not to save us, but to suffer quietly beside us, because he loved in a way that didn't need to be declared. It was love that showed up, love that left water without asking if you were thirsty, love that saw a broken tractor and fixed it without needing to be seen. Weeks passed, we began again, and though I never asked for anything more, something in me ached when I no longer saw him by the tree. I thought he'd gone, that maybe the fire had closed that chapter, but then one morning I found a letter buried under a stone by the fence post. It was short. I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. I only wanted to be near what I admired. No name. No signature, just that. And suddenly I understood all of it. The silence, the distance, the consistency. He was never trying to win something. He was never trying to make himself known. He was just trying to love in a way that didn't burden the one being loved. Years passed, I went on to work, to build, to grow, and he didn't return, but the echo of what he was never left, in every act of quiet kindness I offered others, I found him again. Love doesn't always knock on your door and introduce itself. Sometimes it waits outside quietly, just making sure you're okay, and that's enough. It was never easy to accept help, not because it wasn't needed, but because there was a kind of dignity in surviving with nothing that most people didn't understand. When you've gone without long enough, you start to believe that needing less is a kind of strength. Pride grows where there's no wealth to hold onto, and it can harden you in ways that love struggles to reach. The land was tired, just like my body. The days were long, filled with more work than rest, and money never stretched far enough. Every piece of clothing I wore had been stitched by my own hands, and every meal came from the same stretch of soil that my mother once knelt in, planting hope with seeds. We didn't have dreams, we had duties. And in that life, fairy tales didn't belong. That's why I didn't know what to do with him. He was nothing like the men from our part of the world. The first time he came, he didn't come with words, just quiet eyes and steady hands. He arrived at the market where I sold vegetables, not to bargain or judge, but just to listen. He'd ask simple questions, not about my produce, but about the soil, the rain, the way I tied my baskets with twine. It felt strange, the way he looked at me, not with sympathy, but with something quieter, respect maybe, or curiosity. He never asked what I needed. He simply showed up again the next week, and the next, buying one thing at a time, always paying more than he needed to, and I hated that at first. It made me feel like a cause, like a problem to be fixed, but he never offered advice, never tried to save anything. He just stood near and asked about the weather, the harvest, the kind of plants my mother used to grow. And every time I gave him short, tired answers, he nodded like I'd just told him something important. It went on like that for months. He'd show up once a week, sometimes just to say hello, sometimes just to stand quietly while I packed up. I learned his name from the market whispers. He was a man who owned land far away, properties in cities I'd never seen, money enough to buy 100 farms like mine. And yet, he never mentioned it, never acted like someone from another world. One day, a storm took out half my field. The crops drowned in a night, and with them my hope. I sat on the porch, holding my knees, staring into the soaked ground, and then I saw him, soaked too, standing in the rain like it didn't matter. He walked to me, slow, careful, carrying a single wooden box with fresh seeds. No speech, no grand offer, just seeds, wrapped in a cloth with a tiny note, for when you're ready. I didn't speak, I couldn't. Pride burned in my throat like fire. I wanted to throw the seeds back at him, scream that we were fine, that we didn't need his charity, but I didn't, because I knew deep down This wasn't pity. This wasn't rescue. This was something else. I let the box sit untouched for days, and then I planted them. That spring, something changed, not in the land, but in me. I stopped pushing him away. I didn't open my door to him, but I didn't close it either. I let him help carry baskets to my cart. I let him fix the broken wheel without asking. I let him talk about his mother's garden, the way she used to hum while planting roses. He didn't ask questions he knew I wouldn't answer. And I began to see that his love wasn't loud. It wasn't hungry. It didn't try to change me or rescue me or dress me up in something I wasn't. He loved in a way that made room for my strength. He saw the calluses on my hands and didn't flinch. He saw the way I avoided asking for help and never forced the offer. When he spoke of the future, he never said you should. He only said if you ever wanted to, and let the rest hang in the air like a soft invitation. I think that's what made it real. He didn't come to take over. He came to understand, and somehow that felt more romantic than anything I'd ever read about. He made me feel seen, not as someone broken or needing rescue, but as someone whole, even when everything around me was falling apart. One evening, we sat beside the fire. I was shelling beans. He was fixing a lantern that had lost its light, and out of nowhere, I asked, "Why do you come here?" He looked at me quietly and said, "Because I've never met anyone who loved their life as much as you love yours, even when it gives you nothing." It was then I realized that respect, that stillness, that quiet effort he'd shown me all this time, it was love. Not the kind that demands a spotlight or a declaration, not the kind that needs to be earned, just love, deep, unspoken, steady. He never gave me riches. He never promised me the world, but he gave me something else, space to be proud. And in a world where poverty often robs you of your voice, he let mine speak, and he listened. That's what made him different. He didn't fall in love with a version of me he hoped to create. He fell in love with the version that already existed. Rough edges, tired eyes, unpolished and real. Sometimes the truest love doesn't sweep you off your feet. Sometimes it kneels quietly beside your struggle, lowers itself beneath your pride, and stays, just to remind you that you never had to stand alone. It's easy to believe love must be loud to be real, that it needs to be spoken, declared, proven with grand promises and bold gestures, but I lived something different. I lived the kind of love that never said the word, but somehow never stopped saying everything. He was always around, never close enough to demand anything from me, but never so far that I felt alone. He didn't write poetry. He didn't give speeches. He just showed up over and over again, through seasons of silence, through winters where my heart hardened from years of disappointment, through summers when my hands blistered from long hours in the field. Through all of it, he was there. Not once did he say, "I love you," but not once did I doubt that he did. He'd leave notes sometimes, not love letters, no, just things like, "You might want to check the north fence, looks like it's leaning," or "Brought some extra rope, thought you'd run low." The kind of notes that looked like nothing, but meant everything. The kind that told me he noticed, that he was paying attention, that he cared without needing a spotlight for it. And when I pushed him away, when pride told me I had to do this alone, he didn't argue. He stepped back, always with that same quiet expression that said, "I'll wait." That quiet wait became the most faithful form of presence I've ever known. One year, my father passed. A sudden stroke that took him before I even had time to make peace with all the words we never said. I sat on the floor of our small farmhouse that night, unable to cry, just still, empty, not knowing what the next step would be. That's when I heard the screen door open. He didn't say a word. He didn't come in. Just left a pot of stew and a jar of honey on the porch, with a small note that said, "No need to eat alone tonight." Then he walked away. I didn't stop him. I didn't thank him. But I ate every spoonful like it was the first real meal I'd had in years. When the well dried up that summer and I couldn't afford a new pump, He left a wrapped package beside it before sunrise, not with his name, not with a note, but I knew, I always knew, he never tried to take credit. He never used his help as leverage. He just did what needed to be done and disappeared before I could feel like I owed him anything. There were moments, small ones, that changed everything. The day I fell and twisted my ankle in the orchard, he appeared as if out of the trees, carried me to the house without asking permission, set me down gently, and left a cane carved from cedar with my initials burned into the handle. No conversation, just action, like always. The day I almost lost the farm to a legal technicality, when papers and signatures were needed and my hands shook too hard to hold the pen, he stood silently beside me in the lawyer's office, didn't speak a word. But I could feel his steadiness like a wall behind me, and I didn't fall. He never gave me speeches, never told me how strong I was. He didn't need to, because his belief in me was constant, unshakable, even when I couldn't believe in myself. And when I finally began to rise, to grow, to stand taller in a world that once felt too heavy, he quietly stepped back, never asking for credit, never needing to be seen. That's when I realized what kind of love it truly was. Not the kind that demanded to be the center of my life, but the kind that quietly made room for mine to bloom, that watered my roots without ever asking to be named as the rain, that stood under the sun, letting me take the light. Years passed, seasons changed, and still he stayed. He never moved into my house, never asked me to change my name, never tried to mold me into something that fit his world. He simply fit himself around mine. Like air, like time, like something eternal, you never stop breathing, even when you forget it's there. The older I got, the more I understood how rare it was, how powerful, to be loved so fully without being interrupted, to be given space instead of pressure, to be chosen again and again, not through words, but through presence. I once asked him, on a night when the stars were too loud to ignore, "Why do you do all this for me?" He looked at the sky and said only, "Because I can." That was it. No explanation, no expectation, just because. And when he got sick, when the silence between us grew heavier with the weight of time, I sat by his side, holding his hand the way he used to carry mine when I couldn't walk straight. He still didn't say it, not even then, but in the way he squeezed my fingers, in the way he smiled with his eyes, in the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that ever made sense in his life, I heard it, louder than any words, because sometimes the truest kind of love doesn't need to be spoken to be known. It just stays, steady, silent, and absolutely undeniable. That's how I knew. I didn't know love could be that still. Not still like silence, but still like something that anchors you, even when you forget it's there. I lived most of my life assuming that love had to arrive loud, that it would knock on my door, crash through my defenses, make speeches, fight for me, chase me. I thought if love were real, it would be impossible to ignore. It would demand to be seen, but what I lived was the opposite. He was there before I ever knew I needed someone, always a step behind me, never ahead. Never pulling me, never pushing, just present even when I forgot him. Even when life got hard and I stopped seeing anything but the weight I carried, the bills I couldn't pay, the seasons that ruined crops, the nights that came too fast. He was there. Sometimes he'd show up when no one else remembered I existed. Not with flowers, not with words, but with things that made my life easier. A fresh blade for the plow, firewood stacked quietly beside the door, a coat left on a hook when he saw mine was worn thin. He never asked for a thank you, never stood there waiting to be noticed, and sometimes I didn't even realize it was him until days later. Until I sat down and looked at the pattern, the way something always appeared just when I was about to break, and when I pushed him away, not out of anger, but survival, he didn't get offended. He didn't try to make it about himself. He just stepped further back, out of my way, still near, still quietly close, but never in a way that made me feel small, never in a way that made me feel like I owed him something. He understood something I didn't yet know about love, that it's not about possession or drama or proof. It's about being and being, especially when no one sees you. That's the kind of love he gave. I remember once I was sick, bedridden for nearly a week. No family nearby, no help I could afford. I thought I'd ride it out alone, barely able to lift myself from the sheets, but every morning, without fail, there was soup left outside my door, still warm. Wrapped in a clean cloth, no note, no knock, no name, just love showing up because it chose to. There were years when I drifted, years when I left the farm, tried to make something of myself in a world that didn't understand where I came from. He never stood in my way, never begged me to stay. He just watched quietly, and when I fell apart in that faraway city, when I had no one to call, when shame made it hard to speak, he was the only one who didn't ask questions. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't say anything. He just picked me up from the station, carried my bags to the truck, and drove me home. And the thing is, I forgot him sometimes. That's what I hate to admit. I got so caught up in surviving that I didn't always remember who was in the background, who had been there all along. I overlooked him in the crowd of life's noise. I treated his silence like absence, when in fact it was the deepest form of presence. But love, real love, doesn't disappear when it's forgotten. He stayed. Through every season he stayed. There was a storm one winter that knocked out the power for days. The whole valley was frozen over. I was stuck alone, trying to keep the pipes from bursting and the animals warm. I didn't call anyone. I didn't want to be a burden. But when I opened the barn that morning, I saw fresh hay, dry firewood, and a lantern lit, placed gently near the gate. That was him. It always was. He didn't do it for praise. He didn't do it hoping I'd change my mind or fall at his feet. He did it because his love was never about getting. It was about giving, giving without asking anything back. That kind of love. I didn't recognize it at first, because the world teaches us to look for flash, for chase, for speeches and songs. But the kind of love I found didn't chase. It waited quietly, even when ignored. When I finally found the strength to stand on my own, he didn't try to take credit. When others came around, when people noticed me, admired me, wanted to be close to me, he didn't step in to compete. He simply smiled, nodded, and stepped back further, because he loved me enough to want me to rise, even if it meant he'd be forgotten in the rise. And that's what broke me, not in a painful way, but in a way that changed me. To realize that someone could love me without needing me to love them back in the same way. To know that love could just give and not stop giving, that it could exist for its own sake, not for reward. Not for recognition, but just because. It believed in me. That's when I started to see him again. That's when I began to notice every moment, every gesture, every sacrifice, every silence, and how they'd been shaping my life without my realizing it. I began to remember, and in remembering, I finally understood. He never stopped loving me, not once, not through my worst days, not through my absence, not through the years I gave my heart to people who didn't deserve it. He stayed, not because he was weak, but because his love was strong enough to exist in the background, because it didn't need attention. It just needed to be near. Sometimes the greatest love you'll ever know is the one that doesn't ask to be noticed. It simply is quiet, faithful, unwavering, and when the storms come, when everything else falls away, that love is the one still standing, not chasing, not demanding, just waiting, because that's what love does. If this story touched something quiet in you, if it reminded you of a love that waited or one that you never noticed until now, then you already know it was real. Love doesn't need noise to matter. It just needs truth. So if you felt something today, really felt it like this video, subscribe to the channel and come back for more stories that remind you sometimes the strongest love is the one that never asks to be seen.